Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for attending. Just a quick note that we're going to keep everyone muted and with cameras off during the talk and the question and answer. And then for people who would like to stay and continue the conversation, we can open mics and cameras up for more informal discussion. Also, we are recording to add it to our YouTube archive, and so that has already begun, just so you can take note of that. All right. So a brief introduction before we get started. The Theorypractice Lab is a space for political education, collective study, and community organizing at the University of Waterloo. It's co-led by me, Lisbeth Berbary, and Karim Wissa. We organize events like this to bring people together to better understand the forces shaping our lives, to build relationships across issues, and to strengthen our shared capacity to act. Tonight's teach-in is part of an ongoing collaborative series on housing justice with Textile and the Social Development Center of Waterloo Region. Textile is co-founded by Fitzim Argai, who I've known for about 11 years now, who works in Kitchener-Waterloo and is deeply rooted in local relationships and creative political engagement, while still holding a really clear analysis of how local struggles are shaped by global political and economic systems. And that grounding in both place and struggle resonates strongly with the lab's approach to political education. We're also grateful to be collaborating with the Social Development Center, whose eviction prevention team works directly alongside tenants navigating displacement, mass eviction, and housing precarity in the region. Their commitment to ensuring that those most affected by housing injustice shape the conversation and the response is critical and again strongly resonates with our lab's commitments. And now I'm very glad and excited to introduce Meg Walker. Meg has been organizing in Waterloo Region for the past decade around housing and climate justice. She works with the Social Development Center's eviction prevention team, supporting tenants who are resisting eviction and fighting for housing stability. Meg brings not only policy knowledge, but grounded experience working alongside people navigating the realities of Bill 60 and the broader erosion of tenant protections. So tonight, she'll walk us through how Bill 60 weakens tenants' rights and access to housing justice, and what that means in practice and how it affects individuals, families, and our wider community. So after about an hour or so of teaching, we'll move into the question and answer period. So Meg, we're so grateful, really excited to have met you and to have this opportunity to learn from you as you continue to do so much great work in the region. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I do have a screen to share, but I'm going to just do another sort of breakdown of what I do. Again, my name is Meg Walker, and I'm a tenant organizer with the Social Development Center. We're a housing advocacy not-for-profit that supports housing as a human right on the continuum of homelessness and precarious housing to tenants. So homelessness and precarious housing to tenancy, there's a whole spectrum of homelessness, or at least not security of tenure. Arguably, everyone who is not a homeowner is precariously housed based on the policies in place at all levels of government. Purpose-built affordable housing, rent geared to income, and other supportive housing has been stalled since the 1990s. So the SDC generally has its work cut out for us. I always think it's important to mention that we support and advocate for our neighbours at 100 Victoria. It's a tenant encampment who are under direct threat of displacement by the region. They want them to move, even though there's nowhere to go and no housing for them. We can't talk about housing justice without advocating for those of us the crisis has already made unsheltered. So I'm going to share my screen very quickly. Does everybody see that? Good?
Yes.
Okay. Very brief introduction. In my role as a tenant organizer, I assist whole buildings to organize against displacement, usually evictions, which are evictions for renovations that are in bad faith, because the landlord doesn't intend to let them back in after they've renovated into their other affordable units. They displace them so they can raise the rent. My work is necessarily tenant-led. I not teach people how to organize, I let them embrace their own inner organizer. And I have supported the organizing efforts of several buildings under threat of rent evictions, and we have won every time we have fought. That's not a certainty, but I can attest that collective action and organizing does work. I don't get paid enough to not do it and not actually win, quite honestly. No advocate is. I am, however, the only tenant organizer for an organization that covers the entire region and its municipalities. So what my goal is in being here today is also to give people the impetus and the power to let them know their own power to organize themselves. Many tenants facing evictions and mass displacement don't even get to me. They don't even get before the landlord-tenant board. We have a silent crisis of mass displacement where people leave their units almost immediately because they've been given an eviction notice by their landlord. This is the crisis of silent mass displacement, and that's why we need more tenant organizers in the region. I just want to give a shout out to my team. I work alongside a team of 3 peer support workers who support individuals one-on-one, usually because they lack access to holistic supports in community because they were low income, disabled, newcomer, or another marginalized population. Almost everybody that comes to us has a disability and is low income. The most vulnerable people in our communities are the ones at greatest risk of being evicted and losing their homes. During this presentation, I will often cite anecdotally data and experiences peer workers and anonymized examples of situations we face on the ground. They are generalized, but we have the data to back them up, and we are regularly reporting these to our funders. The crisis is very real. We have the numbers. It's very bad out there. There's nowhere for people to go, and people are being mass evicted. So my team has a wait list. It's long. If you are facing an individual or even a mass eviction, please reach out to me. I tell you this so that you understand the landscape upon which I am working and upon which Bill 60s come into law, because it is law now. It's really bad to not to believe it's really bad, but there are some procedural measures that my team uses to keep people housed, and Bill 60 threatens them directly, and it's just important that you all know how they threaten you. So I'm going to do my next slide. That is my team. That is the rundown of who I work with. Okay, so this talk is going to necessarily be a little jargony because I work within a legal system, so I apologize ahead of time for this. I am going to drop words like LTB, which is a landlord-tenant board, RTA, which is the Residential Tenancies Act. It's the law that governs all law-run tenancies. Arrears, that's when you owe a lot of money, any money to the landlord, and they go to the landlord-tenant board with you to file for an eviction because you owe them money. An order is a decision coming out of a landlord-tenant board hearing. The right of first refusal is when you notify the landlord that you're coming back after your unit after you've been evicted for renovation. You are allowed to do that under the RTA. A renovation is when a bad faith landlord displaces a tenant for renovation but does not honor the right of first refusal, so they can raise rent up to current market rate. I deal with a lot of these, and it's a pretty common practice. The FRPO, which is the Federation of Rental Housing Providers, it's the landlord lobby. I'm going to discuss them a lot because they have a lot of power in Ontario, and they have a lot of power with specific governments as well. ACTO, who are my buddies, that's the Advocacy Center for Tenants Ontario. They have helped me tremendously with a lot of navigating a lot of legalities with tenants. And then just some of the notices that I'll be discussing that are directly affected by Bill 60. And N4, it's a notice that you are in arrears of rent, and it's a notice to end your tenancy early for non-payment of rent. And N8, it's similar, but it's often used as opposed to an N4 because you've been persistently late, so you've been late a few times. An N12 notice is a notice to end your tenancy because the landlord wants to use it. An N13 is a notice to end your tenancy because the landlord wants to demolish, repair, or convert it. So I personally was evicted a few years ago, and my house was turned into a parking lot. So this is all stuff I have experience with. They're very violent systems, and there's a lot of legal language that is meant to obscure all of the violence and harm that happens at the LTB. I want to address a few things that I get from people in community. There's a necessary response to protecting landowners and land ownership. And the people, so there are very few mom and pop landlords, very few of them. Mostly it's corporate landlords that we face. I was planning on discussing some of the traps that Bill 60 leaves for smaller landlords, but I decided to put that aside because I am generally on tenant side in all situations, and I know who exactly I advocate for, so I put that aside. I do refer to bad faith landlords to distinguish between a landlord maybe tries to do good and these corporate landlords or private landlords who spend a lot of time bullying tenants and trying to evict them. I also want people to consider that even if it's a small landlord, a mom and pop landlord is still financially incentivized to evict someone so they can raise their market rent. I am critiquing policies and decisions that have left us with a housing crisis that is only accelerating and incentivizes companies and even smaller people grandparents sometimes to use their homes and their equity and the economic system to get money from other people, to extract money for their own comfort. Housing is a human right. I always approach my work with that full stop. That's the bottom line, rather than a source of wealth extraction for companies and investors. And we will talk a lot about investors because it is a common phrase used by the landlord lobby and other folks wanting to make money off of that. Nobody is undeserving of housing as well. I want to dispel that myth because some very well-meaning advocates sometimes will say, I work full-time, I pay my bills, I don't deserve an eviction. I always approach my work as no one is undeserving of housing. Everybody is deserving. I don't care what's going on with you. Lots of rich people do all kinds of stuff that, you know, if a poor person did, they would frown on. So everybody is deserving of housing. Nobody deserves to be evicted. Housing should not be commodified. So what is Bill 60? Bill 60 received royal assent on November 27th. It was pushed through very quickly by the current government. It's meant to hasten the construction of homes and public transit infrastructure, as well as reduce delays at the landlord-tenant board. But as an omnibus bill, there's more than just those things in it. It includes a lot of other details that obscure the real harm that can cause tenants and housing justice. And there's some other serious problems with it for our communities. The bill isn't good for our communities in general, putting local control of resources and decision-making into corporate and developer control. The bill is supposed to streamline development processes, and this is a quote from the actual bill, so that the government can continue to work with municipal partners to cut red tape, accelerate housing development, and give them the tools needed to build more homes faster. If we consider the lack of affordable housing as a straightforward problem linked to lack of housing stock, one would think that accelerating development would be key in bringing costs down. The bill then presents itself on the surface as pro-tenant and pro-housing. Similarly, Bill 60 is meant to address delays and support backlog reduction efforts at the landlord-tenant board by improving the speed and fairness of processes, limiting bad actors from abusing the system, and including new measures to help balance the rights and responsibility of landlords and tenants to encourage landlords to bring more rental housing online. That's a mouthful, and more or less means we need to make sure that the LTB moves faster and that we get rid of the backlog of cases. It leaves a lot out, though, and we'll talk about what it leaves out, because this is all supposed to sound good. We need more rental housing. We need to balance rights. The landlords have so many and the tenants have very few. We like the words that are being used: fairness, limiting bad actors, and acknowledging the system is being abused and is broken. This is all language that housing advocates and organizers have been using when talking about housing justice. However, all that cutting of red tape is actually code. And if you know enough about politics, you know the red tape is about deregulation and corporate control of housing, including a part of the bill that includes the removal of green standards for new builds and identify future changes with the intent of removing so-called in the actual wording, green development standards at the lot level outside the building to cut red tape and lower income and building costs. I bring this up because tenants already face barriers to climate adaptation. Landlords use air conditioning and other climate adaptive measures to give notices like an N5, which is for damage to a unit. We are already dealing with a lack of climate adaptation, and now anything that's mandated as a climate adaptation for tenants is being removed, like with Bill 60, like access to green roofs for cooling. This could also be for growing food. We already have a lack of space as tenants. We're already pushed to the very limits of building capacities. They have as much money, as many units, and as much money as possible. They're trying to take that away from us. Similarly, it also positions Bill 60 as housing justice and climate justice as antithetical, which is where I live, and that's nonsense. Bill 60 positions, similarly, the bill proposes using technologies such as artificial intelligence to potentially enhance automation of land use, despite AI being heavy use of electricity and water so taking all local planning for land use away from local municipalities and giving it to an AI, which will necessarily deplete the local resources. It's not good stuff. The bill will also create the framework for a new public corporation model for water and wastewater services. This would shift governance from regional council to a majority professional skills-based board of directors, provide broader financing opportunities to reduce reliance on development charges for water and wastewater growth-related infrastructure. Just to break that down, because I had stared at it a long time, this would take control of water management out of municipal control as well, and give that power to a nebulous board so that developers do not have to pay any charges for water or wastewater changes that come with development. This is not supposed to ease the speed of building housing through. This is supposed to ease the speed of building housing through the lens of supply and demand, and is pro-developer, insinuating that the barriers to affordable housing are letting the market do what it wants, rather than deliberate policy decisions of the last 3 decades made by several different levels of government which decided to abandon building purpose-built affordable housing for people. With much of Bill 60, the burden of cost is given to municipalities, while decision-making and benefits are given to developers. So Bill 60 is coming for your community, even if you're not a tenant, and it's scary. So the press release for Bill 60 makes it really clear that this policy aligns itself with developers and corporations. CEOs like Mr. Scott Anderson of the Ontario Home Builders Association applauds the legislation. This is on the press release from the government, as reflecting a growing partnership between government and industry, one rooted in the shared goal of building more homes. Again, this is a partnership between the government and corporations. Homes is also doing a lot of heavy lifting here. What kind of homes? Are they homes appropriate for tenants? Are they affordable? There's no mention of purpose-built affordable housing, just homes in his statement. The inference being single-family homes, not the kind of dense multi-unit builds for rent that would be accessible to people of lower income who cannot afford a house. This gentleman I have up here, this is the press conference for the announcement of Bill 60. Tony Irwin, who's got the big orange triangle above his head, is also quoted on the press release for the bill as FRPO applauds the Ontario government for introducing measures that support timely and effective outcomes at the Landlord and Tenant Board and reduce barriers to purpose-built rental development. Together, these actions will strengthen Ontario's housing sector, support fairness for rental housing providers and residents, and make it clear to bring much-needed rental homes to market. FRPO looks forward to working with the government to advance the successful implementation of these important initiatives. Tony Irwin is the head of the landlord lobby, which is the FRPO. He was standing there with current policymakers to lead the charge on this bill. The FRPO does not support tenants. The word tenant is not mentioned in their statement at all. Fair and balanced system. Their website uses a lot of the same language that Bill 60 uses. Fair and balanced system between renters and landlords, building more rental supply, and to advocate for a better landlord and tenant board that offers reliable and fast access to justice for all. The problem with Bill 60 is that it does not represent justice for all. In fact, the landlord and investor groups were ecstatic, pushing press releases and comms stating Bill 60 passed when it did pass as, quote, a new era of confidence for landlords, condo owners, and real estate investors in Ontario. These are not tenants. These are not people who are building homes. These are people who are investing in homes so they can extract wealth from tenants. And even our lone local landlord watch lobby, and they're literally called landlord watch, they'll show up to council meetings to advocate against tenant protections, stated that Bill 60 is the wake-up call Ontario needs, and says that when tenant organizers claim that housing policy has been hijacked by landlord lobbyists, she, quote, can't help but laugh. If anything, it's been hijacked by taxpayer-funded activist networks, pushing a socialist fantasy. She's positioning having homes for everybody as a socialist fantasy. Emphasis on fantasy. It is not something that she wants to happen. So these are the people behind Bill 60. They're the people who have been pushing for these measures. And this is what we're facing as tenants on the ground in Ontario. Oh, I forgot to do my slides. But yes, Bill 60 is passed. A direct screenshot. Socialist fantasy, making sure people are unhoused. However, what ACTO says, the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario says, Bill 60 weakens access to justice, disregard for eviction prevention and homelessness crisis, deteriorating tenant living standards and advocacy, and it blames tenants for the housing crisis. So what Bill 60 actually does, and I will go into very specific details about why this is bad and makes my job harder, and we should all be very, very vigilant about it. It shrinks timelines to review an LTB order from 30 days to 15. Shortens the time frame from 14 days to 7 for a tenant to pay rent late before a landlord can file for eviction. So all of these timelines are halved. full stop. It limits an adjudicator's ability to postpone an eviction order, mandates a tenant pay off at least 50% of arrears before a tenant can raise issues of disrepair at their hearing, and removes the requirement for a month of compensation if the landlord is evicting for personal use. So I'll break this down one by one. Okay, so tenants often come to eviction prevention individually or as groups with me at the social development during crisis, not having known what to do when they got an end notice, or even waiting to contact us until just before or just after the hearing, because many folks at risk of eviction are already vulnerable for a variety of reasons. They have a disability, they're a newcomer who didn't know how to translate the notices because they only come in French or English. Sometimes folks are elderly, sometimes the mail just doesn't get to you in time. There's a variety of other reasons, why somebody might miss their hearing. So they come to us late often. Also, when somebody is undergoing a crisis, they go into fight or flight, and not everybody is used to fighting. I fight, I'm obstinate, but especially if you're vulnerable, you will go into freeze. You will flee from this situation because you don't know what else to do. It's an instinctive response. So we work a lot on very short timelines. Additionally, the landlord-tenant board is a self-directed system, meaning you can self-represent. Tenants will go to a hearing without legal advice or representation, while the landlord, who generally has more resources, can hire a paralegal and who specializes specifically in the Residential Tenancies Act. There's a lot of them. They advertise on buses. Cohen highly represented my landlord, and they're all over the transit. They're all over transit with wrappers. It's horrifying. These are common scenarios that lead to a tenant either not attending a hearing, the fight or flight response, or not knowing, or not being able to best or justly represent their situation at the LTB. They are the underdogs. They do not have the resource, they do not have the knowledge at the LTB to necessarily get the justice that they deserve, and they often end up summarily evicted. I'm a systems navigator. The eviction prevention team supports systems navigation of the landlord-tenant board. We are not lawyers. We work alongside community legal services who do a fantastic job. They are also overrun. So there's a lot of the crisis that we're seeing, and it's awful, but there's a lot of people who don't even get to us. And if they get to us late. So there are a few orders which we can help a tenant file, which are really important as a Hail Marys to make sure people stay housed. I've done it so many times. An order to review, which is the first order, acts like a safeguard and gives the landlord-tenant board a discretion to review a final order where the order contains a serious error or a party was not reasonably able to participate in the proceeding. Well, at one point in my 3 years of working on this team, I had a gentleman who didn't know that he was being brought before the landlord-tenant board because he was on a helicopter. He was a geologist surveying mineral deposits in Northern Ontario. He came back and the sheriff had been to his house and he was locked out. It should work in theory. It should be usable. We've done it. But tenants often don't understand that they can actually use an order to review in order to have the landlord-tenant board review a decision by the landlord-tenent board. They don't understand that they can ask for a review in the event of a miscarriage or absence of justice, or even know how to file it. This is something that we can do as systems navigators, but only if tenants get to us within that window after the order has been issued. 30 days is already a tight timeline. And shortening that time frame makes it nearly impossible for us to do our job and for any attempt at justice for the tenant. When the gentleman who was a geologist got to me, that 30-day period was already over. I could not help him in that way. Another primary emergency procedural measure that we have as tenants and eviction prevention workers is the motion to set aside an ex parte order. What this means is that it's similar to a motion to review. And again, I'm sorry, this is very dry stuff, but it's stuff that you should know. The team uses this in cases wherein a tenant was not aware of a hearing and the landlord has filed with the LTB directly for an eviction. And this is used, a little bit jargony again, this is used specifically when a tenant has breached an order. So they've had a previous hearing, they went before the board and they had a repayment plan. They had to agree to a repayment plan, and on that repayment plan and the decision coming out of the landlord-tenant board, what was affixed to it is called a Section 78. So what that means is that if the tenant is a day late or $1 short on paying back that rent, the landlord can immediately file with the board without notice for an eviction, which means the sheriff will come to their door without them knowing. And that happens. And we have to file a motion to set aside in order to stop that, so we can come back and the adjudicator can figure out why perhaps their order was breached. I've had many cases where a tenant was fine on our repayment plan, but missed a payment because of mail delays. I know that there are people that have been evicted because they were 60 cents short on their rent, and it doesn't matter because the system is so black and white. That 60 cents was enough for them to be evicted. I've had cases where a building superintendent was not cashing the check or losing it. They were purposely not interfering with payment of rent, and so we had to file an ex parte order because things happen. Even when your landlord is not actively working against you, things happen, and a motion to set aside is the only recourse we have in preventing evictions at this stage and to stop the share from coming to the tenant's door. Setting the time frame for this motion from 30 to 15 days under Bill 60 again hampers our ability to support workers and tenants to help themselves in responding to an unjust order and decision. The stark black and white nature of the RTA and LTB systems already do not leave a lot of wiggle room for justice or ways around barriers put in the way purposely of vulnerable tenants to threaten their tenancies. Landlords who want people out because they're not paying below market rent will actively mess with tenants. There are tried and true strategies, unfortunately, for them to be doing this. If we have a shorter timeline to respond to these mechanisms, we cannot successfully keep ourselves or each other housed. Bill 60 also puts money towards hiring more sheriffs so that we can get people out of their homes faster. Bill 60 also limits, sorry, landlord, I'm not good at the slides. This is what it is. Bill 60 also limits an adjudicator's independent discretion to make decisions based on Section 82 and Section 83. And these are very specific sections of the Landlord Tenant Board. And adjudicators, we make jokes a little bit because you never know who you're gonna get. They are a legal representative, similar to a judge, and they make decisions based on their interpretation of the law. Sections 82 and 83 give the adjudicator the ability to postpone or relieve eviction based on the landlord not fulfilling their responsibilities regarding repair or safety of the unit. Section 83 is a human rights measure embedded in the RTA, giving the adjudicator discretion to stop an eviction based on the potential unfairness of the process toward the tenant or circumstances of the tenant and their impact on children and families. It is meant to consider the tenant's rights as a person and extenuating and systemic circumstances that often lead to a threatened tenancy. Imposing restrictions on the adjudicator's ability to apply human rights considerations to a potential eviction inhibits tenant support team, and it is a human rights violation, in my opinion. The support team also includes legal and peer support to prevent a bad faith or otherwise unwarranted eviction. It also prevents the adjudicator from considering a landlord who is purposely neglecting a unit so that they can force a tenant out or is just not living up to their responsibilities. This actually makes it easier for a landlord not to fulfill their end of the bargain. So this is not a balance or justice or a fair LTB. It's specifically undermining what rights tenants have. They literally narrow access to justice for a tenant at the Landlord Tenant Board and stops their own adjudicator from making the best decision if that's in the interest of the tenant. So, like I said, disrepair in buildings is also a master and eviction tactic. Bad faith landlords often specifically target below market rent units. We have one that's going around buying older buildings who do need some repair. It might not be major, but they'll put new plumbing in that might not necessarily be needed. Or they'll just let it go to waste. They'll just let it run down. And these tenants are usually vulnerable. They've been living in their units for 30, 40 years, 10 years. They have significantly lower rent than newer buildings. Elderly people, and they kick them out under the pretenses of renovations. And paralegals representing the landlord will say at hearing, well, who doesn't want a new renovation? Who doesn't want a renovated unit? The problem is that often enough renovations, the period of time go from 7 to 9 months on purpose. So a tenant will be expected to leave for that time, get a new unit, and there is some compensation involved, but they have to get a new unit and sign a year lease, and they cannot get back to their old unit in time. A lot of these renovations are also superficial. They're not necessary. And then when they want to come back to the unit, the landlord, because they're already out, will have already leased that unit to someone else who also has rights and is right not to be evicted. And the rent will be much at market rent as opposed to the old affordable unit. Getting tenants, we want to keep tenants where they are, removing tenants is really a strategy, and they use disrepair for that as well. And that's why, again, not letting an adjudicator consider disrepair or limiting their ability to consider the circumstances under which somebody has to move deeply limits the adjudicator's ability to consider landlord neglect and enable rent evictors. I think I'm out of order here. That's okay. So there's also a shortened timeline for tenants to pay late rent and a redefinition of what's called persistent late payment. As it stands right now, if you are late on your rent, and many people are experiencing economic hardship right now in some way or the other, but especially if you're vulnerable, disabled folks on a fixed and people on a fixed income, there's a lot of intersecting reasons why somebody might be late on the rent. It's not a moral failing. It happens. The landlord can issue what's called an N4 on the first day you are late with your rent, but cannot file for a hearing. The landlord can evict you, but they can file for a hearing at the landlord tenant board, which can evict you. They can't do that before 15 days have passed, or previously haven't been able to do that. Now they can file for an eviction hearing after 7 days. This time period, the 15 days usually give tenants some time, if not a lot, to get their finances in order, to figure out what happened, for the checks to get cashed, for things to get mailed. But now there's half the time. But 60 has that time for 14 days to 7 days only, which does also not line up with monthly pay periods. Oftentimes, if you're short at the first of the month, you can make it up for it in the middle of the rent, and sometimes people get by that way. Including myself, like I'm shorter on money at the beginning of the month than I am later on, because that's when bills come due. So that doesn't align with the way pay structures are traditionally or like generally done. It also means that a landlord can very swiftly apply to the landlord tenant board for a hearing before the tenant has any chance to figure out how and when to get rent paid to them. What follows is usually a hearing at the landlord tenant board, even if the rent has been paid. So even if you do get that paid off, and you were able to make it in that 7 days, you will still have to have a hearing, and you still get fined $186 in a filing fee that the landlord will expect you to pay because you were late. And now they can do that at 7 days. Many tenants, especially those whose housing is already precarious because of bad faith landlords, do not have that extra money, that extra $106 in their budget to pay a filing fee, whether or not they paid their rent or not. And a brief 7-day window that the landlords now have to file for an eviction make it easier for landlords to issue N4s very quickly as a means to bully tenants and chip away at their finances through eviction notices. This can easily chip away at someone's income, especially if it's not a lot of income anyways. And that's a way to bully tenants into moving, or at least getting evicted full stop, because the landlord no longer wants that tenant renting their unit. Bill 60 also now has the potential. They haven't drafted this language yet, as far as I could research, but they can now define what persistent late payments are. Whereas before, adjudicators were able to use their discretion to decide what that means. Whether it's you missed twice, you missed 4 times, you missed 8 times, it's always been up to discretion of the adjudicator, and they could decide based on circumstances whether or not it was a late payment. This change, again, undermines any possible justice for income precarious tenants who have been late paying but have been paying their rent. Given the rest of the amendments in Bill 60, I see no reason to be optimistic about the definition of persistent late payment to be in tenants' favor. It will definitely be pro-landlord. And again, this will make it easier to evict low-income tenants with no other place for them to go, and incentivizes bad faith actors and landlords to disrupt tenants' methods of payment. Sometimes a landlord will they'll give you like a rent payment platform all of a sudden that nobody knows how to use. There will be glitches in the rent payment platform. Rent checks don't get paid, and the burden's all on the tenant as opposed to the landlord. And this will be like, see what they did? They didn't pay this, or this was like this time for these 3 months. And if a tenant is not prepared with receipts and proof that they tried, it's really hard to prevent an eviction there, generally. Okay. So, demanding tenants pay 50% of arrears now before they go before the board for disrepair. One of the primary consequences of having an apartment that is in disrepair is that those disrepairs interfere with a tenant's daily life. At Eviction Prevention, we commonly support tenants whose units are in such a state of disrepair that they are unable to cook food at home. They face extra heating costs and clothing costs because they are cold. They have no water, so they aren't able to shower. The parking lot snowed in, you can't get to work. Being poor is expensive. Poverty is a relentless job. It is difficult. And it's doubly so when you live in a unit where a bad faith landlord isn't fulfilling their responsibilities, and that negligence is actively inhibiting your means of caring for yourself and your families. These expenses and income loss often end in a tenant being late on rent. In less common situations, tenants will stop paying rent because they are not actually benefiting from the services, a safe and secure unit that they are paying for. So there's a variety of reasons why somebody might be in arrears of rent, including very deep disrepair. That is a lack of care and concern on the landlord's part. It's active negligence. A landlord's responsible to make sure the unit is safe. So with Bill 60, a tenant who falls into arrears cannot bring up any disrepair at the landlord-tenant board or the negligence of maintaining the unit unless they pay half of the rent they already owe. A tenant cannot bring up possible reasons for being behind on the rent unless they pay the landlord first, even if the landlord is derelict in their responsibility, leading to an income loss to the tenant. The adjudicator cannot consider this until that 50% is paid. This measure is unnecessarily punitive, and that means a tenant cannot access a conversation, not even a conversation, about the state of their housing and the injustice they are facing unless they are financially prepared to pay the landlord for the opportunity. Landlords and property management companies are also not the most reliable narrators when it comes to how much tenants might owe in arrears, claiming payment wasn't made when it was, or just confusing the numbers in general, giving wrong numbers. If a tenant has to, without question, pay 50% of the arrears before accessing any kind of justice, a landlord is incentivized to give incorrect numbers, because even if they don't do it on purpose, it can't hurt. They don't have to be sure it's right, because they'll just get free money, and they don't even have to. They just right up front. Mandating tenants pay 50% of the rent ahead of hearing concerns about lack of safety and lack of repair to a unit also means proactive tenant measures like a strategic rent strike can no longer be used to be heard before the landlord-tenant board. Tenant unions like the York Southwestern Tenant Union in Toronto have previously withheld a measured amount of arrears, like a month of rent per unit affected, in conjunction with filing a T filing against their landlord to have repairs done in the building. So you withhold some arrears, so the landlord will take you to the board, but at the same time you file against your landlord to get things fixed. Because the landlord filings at the landlord-tenant board happen on a much faster timeline than tenant filings, it takes about 18 months for a tenant to be heard if there's a problem. A rent strike is a way for tenants to hold the landlord accountable to their responsibilities. The arrears are always paid off. They're held in trust, but tenants are able to be heard much faster with this type of rent strike. But if tenant unions and associations are being forced to pay 50% in advance, their point of leverage and power in negotiating with the landlord, who has all the power, so that their rights are upheld, is significantly weakened. So this is a union vesting measure. And then we come to removing the requirement to give 1 month's compensation for an N12. So an N12, at least for now, it's I noticed that your landlord wants to use their unit, your house, whatever, they want to move themselves in, or their family members in. So they want to reclaim their property. And you have to give usually 120. You don't have to give 120 days, but if the notice right now is 120 days, you still got compensation. They're trying to remove they're trying to remove any hope of compensation for people who have to move because their landlord is moving in. And as the title would suggest, an N12 is issued because the landlord wants to move in. Corporations cannot use them because they are not people. No matter what anybody tells you, corporation is not a people. Again, the communications from the government and the press releases from the policymakers and landlord interests position this change as benign. The landlord wants to move themselves or family members into their own property, and 120 days is a fair and reasonable window of time for the tenant to find a new unit. I apologize for the sniffles. This alleviates the very huge problem of the housing crisis itself. The vast majority of tenants cannot afford to move, and 4 months is not much of a runway for finding a new unit, especially given market rents right now. There is no timeline long enough if there's simply nowhere to go and you can't afford a new unit. It doesn't matter how much time you got. You can't move. On average, rental costs roughly $1,000 per bedroom plus utilities. Long-time tenants in the region right now are paying about half that if they are lucky enough to stay in their units, many of which also include utilities. If a tenant with a family of 4, like my family, because when I was evicted, had to move right now, from a unit that was roughly $1,000 to $1,200, they are looking at rents approximately $2,500 to $3,000. This is what my situation was. This is what we faced. This was the case for my family, and we were lucky enough. I fought my landlord to stay in my home and resisted demolition for about 7 years. Our financial situation changed, so we were able to move. It wasn't easy. It stunk. It was hard. It was violent. It was difficult. And it was still better off for me than it would be for anyone else. That doesn't happen to most people facing eviction. They don't have the connections or the financial situation to move. There's nowhere for them to go. It doesn't matter if you give them 4 months. Many of the tenants who are being evicted by N12s are also looking at moving into units that are significantly smaller than the unit they are being evicted from. A lot of people are being forced from larger homes, townhouses, and these are folks with larger families who are being forced from their 3-bedroom units into much smaller units that are not built for families. They are only meant as an investment opportunity in high rises. They're not big enough. They're not purpose-built for families or affordability. Because corporations have been purchasing starter homes, especially since at an accelerated rate since 2018, there is a dearth of purpose-built family homes and starter houses for young families, even to rent. These starter homes are either demolished or duplexed into something much smaller so that more wealth can be extracted from them per person. What is instead being built, as far as the rental market is concerned, are high-rises whose material value is for investors and not for people who want to live in them. I say this a lot, and it always remains true. There is nowhere for people to go. The compensation required by the RTA is also the current rate of rent for the unit that is being moved into. It is not market rate. It is that $1,000 rent that you're already paying. It's not market level. Using myself again as an example, my landlord was not required to foot anything but the $1,000 we paid in rent to him every month. He did not have to pay any of the difference between that rate and the significantly higher rate at our new place. Moving was also expensive, and none of those costs were covered under the Residential Tenancies Act. He did not have to help us at all. And moving is expensive. It's not just feasible for most people. And even having said that, at least the RTA mandated some kind of compensation, even if it was woefully inadequate. It was the floor. We should be getting more compensation as opposed to less compensation. So now under Bill 60, tenants will be denied even that smaller inadequate amount to tenants with appropriate notice, even though there's no such thing as appropriate notice. There's no time for anyone. Now, this is all under the assumption that the landlord is acting in good faith, which is not always true, even with N12s. N12s are mechanisms by which smaller landlords and even corporations have used to evict tenants for larger rent. Smaller landlords may be smaller potatoes against corporations, but their class interests are not in alignment with the average tenant's class interest. They have equity in a house and are motivated to bring rents up to market rate. Yes, even grandma. After an N12 eviction is ordered, tenants have to remain vigilant to ensure that the landlord or someone who is related to the landlord has actually moved into their unit, because that doesn't always happen. Tenants have found that a unit has remained empty, and I've supported folks through these hearings or these situations after they've left their homes or the house that have been listed for sale. So they move out, think everything is in good faith, find that their house has been listed for sale or that nobody's lived there. So they're leaving it empty for a month so they can sell it or move new people in. Corporations can also sell off single-family dwellings to employees so that it can appear to the LTB that the N12 is in good faith and somebody's moving into it, an actual person, but that doesn't stop the contractors from coming in and duplexing it so they can make a house into 3 or 4 smaller units. It's really common, turning what would be a dwelling for a family of 5 into something that houses 4 students. And the students are not responsible for this, they're extracted from as well. Removing required compensation only incentivizes and further enables bad faith landlords to continue to do what they're doing and displace tenants from affordable units in order to extract higher rents. So this has been a lot. For all of that dryness, this is an actual huge crisis. And how do we respond? It's hard to face all of this, to know that we're the underdogs, to know that we are in crisis, and that the end result of being displaced and homeless is often death or a shortened lifespan. I'm not going to lie to you about that. I am often the person that gives people bad news. However, I would also like to bring up one measure that didn't make it into Bill 60, and this is the scariest one, in my opinion, and none of it's good. And that is something that the Federation, so the FRP, or the Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario, have actively been pushing for, and we cannot relax on. We can't relax on this. We can't relax on anything, but this is especially bad. And that is the end of security of tenure for tenants in Ontario. In the initial conversations around Bill 60, the end of month-to-month leases for tenants was proposed as one of the measures. That would mean that after a year's lease ended, tenants would be subject to changes to their entire lease, including rent increases and all other terms. It would effectively be the end of rent control in Ontario. A landlord could change your lease at any time. Right now, all builds and created units before 2018 are subject to rent control, meaning that the landlord can increase the rate only based on the established rent increase guideline for that year. It's usually based on inflation, so it varies year by year, but this year, pardon me, it's been about 2.1%. It's not supposed to be 2.5%, otherwise the landlord has to apply to the Landlord Tenant Board for what's called an above guideline increase. However, if you live in a unit that was created or built, and they can create new units after 2018, and it still counts as a new build. After 2018, the landlord can raise the rent to whatever they want, which is deeply problematic if the only solution being proposed to the housing crisis by policymakers is to build new housing based on market principles rather than purpose-built affordable housing and maintaining housing stock. If we let the market decide this, everybody's going to have absurd rent, and people won't be able to afford to live. Now, this was so scary that there was an immediate backlash to even the potential that this measure would be included in Bill 60 by tenants, tenant association, housing advocates, homelessness advocates, everybody who cares about housing and understand that it's a human right and not a socialist fantasy. To illustrate how big a deal it would be if security of tenure was ended, about a third of the region's population are renters. At least half of Toronto are renters. All of these people would suddenly have no right to stay in their units, and they would be denied due process, because if the security of tenure and if your security of your lease is ended, there is no recourse before the Landlord Tenant Board. They can do whatever they want with your lease and your tenancy. Their leases could have been subject to dramatic changes to the point that even fighting at the LTB would have been nearly impossible. Security of tenure is the one solid right that we have to stay as tenants. It means that we have security of living in our homes unless the Landlord Tenant Board says otherwise. And it is the only means we have to the right of due process as a Landlord Tenant Board based on our shared agreement with our landlord. The landlord cannot just change the parameters of our housing, and if month-to-month leases end, if leases after a year can be changed any which way we want, we don't have any choice in our housing. So after all of that pushback, the policymakers behind Bill 60 made an announcement that they were not considering ending month-to-month leasing security of tenure at this time. At this time, doing a lot of work there. Make no mistake, though, the FRPO very much wants to end rent control. There's no assurance that the end of security of tenure will not be a policy decision in the near to long-term future, not just because the FRPO will continue to push for it, but because as tenants, our class interests are not the same as the class interests of property owners or even many of our decision makers and policymakers. And that's why we organize. So, Ricardo Tranjan is going to be here next week. We're going to have a conversation with him, and he wrote this amazing book called The Tenant Class. And I guess the question for a lot of tenants that I support is, what do we do? But even how do we do it? Do we have to? Is anybody coming to save us? And to quote Bruno Dobson, who I've been able to meet online and organize with, by way of Ricardo Tranjan's book, to quote, "We either organize ourselves and confront landlords, or we succumb to their whims. No one is coming to save us. No one is coming for us." And this echoes a lot of organizing mantras, is that we save ourselves. We don't wait for other people in power to save us. We work together. My response, and this might be shocking, as an organizer to oppression and to harm and to violence and to decisions people make for us, is always collective action on a small and large scale. It sounds simple, and it is simple in very many ways, but it's also complicated when you're faced with the, oh, I'm being harmed. What do I do with it all? So I call it micro and macro organizing. So what I do in my role is I help buildings in a decentralized way come together and work at resisting usually it's a crisis, because a crisis has come to pass, an eviction. But you don't have to wait to start organizing for the crisis to start for you personally, because it's happening to someone else. There's already a crisis. I like to start small because I have big ADHD brain as well. So let's consider how we begin as tenants in a building in a neighborhood, and that's where we organize. And this works because coming together as a community has saved the tenancies of every single building I've supported, as I said before. It has worked on the small scale, just starting to know your neighbors, talking to your neighbors. Organizing doesn't have to be about changing everything everywhere all at once, but you can create immediate change for the people around you. And even if your immediate goal is not starting a tenant union or an association, people are sometimes very upset at the idea of a union. You can call it an association, still, what it is. You can just start by building connections with your neighbors, your building, the people, and if you're in a big building, the other units or people who are just around you. I started tenant organizing because we were about to be mass evicted, and I was out gardening during the pandemic, and I was just talking to my neighbors. It doesn't have to wait until crisis. Knowing people and building connections is how we build power with the potential to face down the socioeconomic powers that threaten us. And if you're a tenant, that is landlords, that is capital investors that buy up property in order to extract money from it. So it's actually very simple. And it's a way to start building social infrastructure, which is something that uses interconnection between people to collectively build power rather than money and hierarchy. We live in a society where we are atomized by our own personal lives and our economic class as workers first. We go to work, we come home, we have dinner, we try to take care of our kids. It's sometimes very hard with all the burdens that we bear to create community. It is, however, absolutely worth it, and it is how we keep each other safe. But it's not as easy as just going out there. There's a lot of emotional labor that goes into organizing, even though it's worth it. You have to own your own vulnerability and uncertainty and just start, even if the outcome isn't clear. And you have to acknowledge, especially somebody who's just now contending with the displacement crisis, that you are the next in a chain of violence and displacement, and work alongside people who are the most vulnerable. And embracing uncertainty and your worldview as it has been up to now when your tenancy has been threatened, or when you recognize that the world isn't safe for you, the sense of uncertainty it creates is terrifying, I'm not gonna lie, but it's also only in that space of uncertainty that change is really possible. When you brush aside all of your assumptions about the way the world is and what you deserve and what other people deserve, suddenly you know that everything can be changed because it doesn't have to be this way. Money and law are certainty. We have to embrace the uncertainty, because that is the certainty about lack of change is also how we got here, and gives your landlord this sense of right to harm you. With that in mind, again, first step is to start building community in your immediate proximity. It can look very simple, showing up to community events, volunteering to help a neighbor. I started organizing by just showing up and saying, hey, give me something to do. You can also take a look at the landscape around you. There are other tenant organizers. If you want to bring your building and your small association of neighbors alongside you to a bigger organizing strategy, you can find it. Ask who you can help. And just talking to your neighbors, it's surprisingly simple to just be present, find space to be present. And even though it can be a lot, collectively, that's how we hold all those pieces. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. I'm trying not to get ahead of myself. In their book, Emergent Strategy, about organizing, one of my favorites, Adrienne Marie Brown, writes that successful organizing necessarily builds movements for justice and liberation that leverage relatively simple interactions, like talking to your neighbors, to create complex systems, patterns, and transformations, making non-linear and iterative change, creating more possibilities. So talking to your neighbor means them talking to their neighbors, which means possibly you end up with a tenant union that intersects with other tenant unions, and we become so obnoxious and big that we have a better chance at collective action and systemic change, something big that starts with you talking to each other, with us advocating for each other. And when I give these talks, invariably somebody says, I don't like my neighbors. I find people exhausting. I also find people exhausting. I live in a place with, sort of I don't agree with the political ideology. But I can assure you that if you're concerned about something, about being a tenant and your rights as a tenant and your access to your home, there's somebody else in your space, in your community, in your building that is also worried about it. We're all ourselves individual and amazing, but we also are not so unique in that we are the only ones that care. Knowing that other people care is key to organizing. And these are people who you're not necessarily have everything in common with. You don't even have to like them, especially. I differentiate community from friendship because community are people you live alongside and build a mutual understanding and a goal with. You don't have to like them, but you do need to have a certain amount of respect and work with them for outcomes that are mutually beneficial. You have to share an interest. And there has to be a mutual accountability. It's not always easy. It's emotionally laborious. There are people, but these are people that you see around you every day. And those are the people you are likeliest to have the most economic interests with. You have common economic interests in your building, in your neighborhood. You are both tenants. You are both at risk of eviction. And though not everybody you are an immediate community with will want or have capacity to organize, at least some of the time. So people have different levels of ability, different levels of bandwidth, different skills. The amazing thing about collective action is that no one has to hold all the pieces. And I often liken collectivity and collective actions as to being part of an ecosystem. I like ecosystem because it reframes how we interact with each other as lateral and supportive, even if different, as opposed to hierarchical. I eschew hierarchy. That's why we are where we are. Not everybody contributes to the ecosystem the same way. There are different roles to be played, but all maintain the stability and health of that system. They're all necessary and supportive of each other. There's always risk of burnout, but my approach to organizing tenants is the end goal is to create mutually beneficial support systems wherein tenants can step in if someone else needs rest. It is the opposite of the monoculture, where everybody does the same thing, where where nobody's replaceable and we all have to burn out. It is working together collectively because we all know this is what we've got. We have nobody but each other, and we cannot wait for people to save us. And this all seems relatively high level, a little theoretical, but it really just comes down very much to building relationships with people and maintaining connections towards that common goal, which is housing security. And if you come from this, if nothing else, if you come from this, being able to help your neighbor understand they only have 7 days before the landlord files for an eviction, or you can tell everybody in your building, this is what an N12 is, this is worth my time. This is a small action that I can undertake to potentially not only help you create a tenant union, talk about why tenant unions are necessary and why collective action is necessary, but you can help someone. I can help you help someone stay housed. We can as a community figure out how to support each other collectively. You can face the power of your own landlord at a smaller scale and a larger scale if we link our arms together and create a supportive net where we all help each other and we work together in small ways that ripple out to big ways. So how does that turn into the macro organizing? By connecting to other tenants and tenant unions who also want to speak out. So I very much like the model of decentralized. So everybody, we're in a matrix. We have our own little unit, but we're interconnected, right? So we connect to other tenant unions, other buildings regionally, other municipalities that are going through it, because they're all going through it. We're not in a vacuum. The housing crisis is massive. The larger community, other cities, build those connections outward so your voices get louder as we become more. Policymakers have a harder time ignoring you. One person facing an eviction in one of the buildings I support, as opposed to 35 people, that kept people housed. Last year, I helped prevent more than 60 evictions because we all worked together. And that is not even me, that is them. They did that. I was just fortunate enough to help them. The important thing is that everyone is strategizing and moving towards a common goal in solidarity. And the more we are seen visibly acting against the oppressive societal and economic systems, the more people will act in addition to. More voices will add. There's a quote that I love that's courage calls to courage everywhere. So you will see that we can stand up for ourselves and more people will stand up for themselves and for each other. Tenants who press for their rights against illegal and unfair landlord practices will be able to empower other tenants in a long chain that will ultimately lead to enough pressure that systems will have to adapt or change entirely, maybe to the point where it's no longer recognizable at all. But there will be change, and that's through the power of numbers. And as I wrap up here, solidarity also extends outwards past our borders, because I am of the opinion that borders should not exist. So we have to throw in with other victims of displacement. And again, that sometimes presents with a certain level of discomfort, especially for white settlers and people who are now just recognizing that nobody is safe, including them. I support a lot of folks who have sudden precarious housing because suddenly their landlord isn't any good, and who may have previously been really fine with landlords in general, even though they evict other people. And I have patience for these folks. Everybody's on, I have patience for people suddenly coming on side. But these are long-term tenants who never thought their tenancy would be at risk because the housing crisis hasn't gotten to them yet. They are aghast at the injustice. I hold a lot of feelings about how unjust things are, and I gently remind them in a trauma-informed way that injustice has always been present. It's just caught up to them. We can look at our unhoused neighbours at 100 Vic and across Ontario, see that people have been displaced from their homes long before this moment. No one is on the street by accident. It's a policy choice. And on a larger scale, evictions are on a continuum, and Ricardo's book does a great job of this, and you don't always see it. A lot of advocacy, unfortunately, is about who deserves to be displaced and who doesn't deserve to be displaced, and doesn't really reckon with settled colonialism in Canada and the ongoing genocide of Indigenous people and nations. Evictions are on a continuum of displacement that began on this land when European colonists forced Indigenous communities from their homes. That was the first eviction on this land. We also look at what is happening in Gaza right now. To quote Ricardo Tranjan, reconciling a class-based struggle against landlords and the ongoing fight for decolonization remains a challenge, but one that we have to as white settlers and people who have been more comfortable, people whose history are complicit with eviction and displacement, which is always necessarily violent and murderous, depending on where you are. But we have to, if we want to keep ourselves safe, we have to also make sure we reconcile with the land that we're on and the first peoples of North America, and throw in with solidarity across the entire world. And that's how we actually also become better, is by joining, or bigger, as we join in solidarity across multiple intersections of injustice and violence. And that seems like a lot, but again, start small, go big, and you're not alone. We give up our certainty and our sense of safety and our preconceived notions of who deserves to be on the land for solidarity with everyone who's been displaced, because that's actually how we keep ourselves safe, by keeping everybody else safe as well. So that is it. This is Bill 60. And I firmly believe that we can organize in small ways to make ourselves bigger towards the horizon of systemic change that is necessarily anti-colonial and recognizes human rights over profit. And that is a real possibility, and our only real power is each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Meg. That was absolutely fantastic. You gave such clarity to Bill 60, and you brought so much care to this. And it wasn't just about breaking down Bill 60, but like in helping us really understand how that is playing out in our lived experiences and tenants' lives in the Waterloo region. It's very clear that it's not positioning our communities towards justice for all, and your examples really highlighted the multiple forms of exhaustion and precarity that kind of accumulate on individuals and communities when tenant rights aren't prioritized. So I just wanted to thank you for all the time and care that you put into that. So now we're going to move into the question and answer period, and I'm actually going to stop recording, and then I'm going to turn it over to Fitsum, who's going to lead that. Because we're a small group, Meg, are you okay if we kind of let people's cameras come on and we chit
absolutely.
chat?
I know half the people in this room, so they're used to me yelling about this too, which is very funny.
Same. Okay, let me just stop the recording just so that we have some freedom to speak. So the recording and transcription is now